The U.S. system of government took a great deal of debate and discussion, largely because there were no existing models at the time. There were no systems of government that they could emulate and then just replicate. So, for example, several years after the U.S. Constitution was ratified and implemented, other countries tried to replicate our system of government. But at the time of the founding, there was no model that they could sort of just kind of, create an exact replica of. So that's why it required so much debate and discussion. And again, I think there was so much concern about creating a leader that would resemble a tyrannical leader, a single individual, a single monarch. So there was fear in creating that, and that led to a system of checks and balances. And so it resulted in the three branches and a presidency that would not be able to act unilaterally.
I think that there was some confusion in Philadelphia about exactly what kind of executive they would develop. And look, we've been arguing for over 200 years now about the success of their handiwork. They were trying to create not exactly an elective monarch, but something that looked awfully close to it. And the framers were very erudite people. They were very well read. Certainly, Mr. Madison foremost among them understood the history of government, understood but more importantly, as I've just indicated, they understood the history of government in these assembled colonies, and were trying to figure out a way to develop a government that would survive and equipoise. And that was a very tricky thing to do. I think it's striking, if you look at the Constitution, the difference between Article 1 and Article 2. Article 1 is a very long, elaborate set of provisions for the powers that the Congress would exercise. There's been enduring debate about whether those were supposed to be limited just to those enumerated provisions, or whether those were enumerated provisions that were effectively open-ended in terms of Congress under things like the General Welfare Clause and so forth. Presidency is very different, right? The Article 2 begins effectively by saying the executive powers of the government will be vested in a president of the United States. Now, in contemporary discourse, this has taken on a life of its own. The vesting clause, by a group of people who believe in a theory called the unitary theory of executive power, suggests that that simple provision was freighted with all kinds of meaning because people had a broad understanding of what the executive power was, and rather than limiting it by this vast set of enumerated principles, they decided in the case of the presidency that it would be an empowering feature not to enumerate those powers.
The phrase energy in the executive refers to the notion that you want a president who has capacity to act in times of emergency. Wartime is a good example of that, perhaps some economic crisis. But at the same time, you want the president to be checked because you're so fearful of creating an executive, a single individual who can be so dominant as to become a tyrannical leader.
An energetic executive was a compromise, really. It was the idea that you needed someone who could be there to defend the values of Americans, to look at the United States as a single entity that had specific needs, that was able to take what the public was saying and translate that into some sort of direction, into some sort of policy. The debates around the executive early on were multiple. There were questions about term length. There were questions about whether not just term length, but the number of terms that someone could serve. There were questions about whether we should have a singular executive or a plural executive. These were all foundational questions for the upstart United States, but they were ones that were absolutely crucial for the direction that the United States moved toward. And ultimately, having a single executive whose powers were constrained by other branches and by the public will was seen as the way to make sure you had a robust individual in office who could do what the public wanted that person to do, but also met the types of barriers that didn't necessarily exist under the English crown.
I think what the founders meant by energy in the executive was the opportunity to use statecraft to develop the direction of the nation. I also think it's the case that they understood in the dangerous world that they lived in at the time. I mean, having just come out of a war of independence where the results of the war had not been fully realized. I mean, there were enemies right around the periphery at the time. There was an understanding that not just for domestic purposes, but certainly for foreign policy purposes, that you needed a strong executive, a strong commander-in-chief to protect the nation from its enemies. And so if you look at the articles in the Federalist Papers that Hamilton wrote in particular, and this Hamilton being the most convincing exponent of a strong executive, what he means by energy is the ability to act with dispatch, the ability to keep secrets at times in ways that in a democratic political order often aren't embraced. But there was an understanding that there had to be within a government the opportunity for vigorous action in a way that they knew that a government that relied principally on a Congress or an assembly could not routinely do. And that's where I think that image comes from in the Constitution. That energy is a necessary component for self-preservation. As one of the Supreme Court justices once wrote, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, that we understand we've got divided institutions, that there's a Bill of Rights with individual liberties, but there are going to be certain circumstances the founders understood very well in which we're going to have to depart from those standards and rely on a greater sense of uniformity in government, and that was probably going to come under presidential direction.
The creation of the executive in the United States was surely experimental, but so was the entire system. This was new. This was governing experimentation at its finest. There were threads of it that existed in France, in early Greece, and in other areas, but the model as a whole was brand new. And so the framers, the founders, were really scientists. They were conducting their own experiment in a way that mattered to hundreds of thousands of people at the moment, and eventually millions of people over the course of the life of the Republic. And the creation of the presidency, the American presidency, was risky. There were few models to go off of, and the idea that we needed the power, a strong central government, and an individual who would serve as a singular executive, to some reeked of monarchy. And in fact, in one of the ironies, the goals of the convention, the goals of the founding, were almost violated because of the person they had in mind to hold the office first. George Washington, some wanted to grant the presidency for life, which would have, of course, been a monarchy in itself, and in violation of every motivation of the revolution. But at the end of the day, theory and will and understanding and an assist from General Washington made it so that there were traditions in place and then eventually institutions in place that would limit the term length of presidents.